She wiped tables with trembling hands, unaware that the man watching her used to be the little boy she once rocked to sleep. He hadn't seen her in over 4 decades, and when he realized who she was, what he did next left everyone speechless. Before we begin the story, don't forget to like, share the video, and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers soon. Your support is the motivation that drives us to create even more engaging content. Thank you. The conference had ended an hour ago, but Elon Musk wasn't ready to return to the noise. The press, the handshakes, the suits that said all the right things but meant none of it, it drained him in a way no meeting ever could. He stepped away from the sleek hotel entrance and let his feet wander down a quieter street in San Francisco. The late afternoon wind tugging gently at his jacket. Half a block down, a small cafe caught his eye. It was tucked between a dry cleaner and a bookstore with dusty windows. No neon signs, no digital menus, just a hand-painted sign above the door and the scent of fresh coffee drifting out. It felt real. Inside, it was warm and unhurried. The kind of place where time didn't move so fast. A few college students sat huddled over laptops. An elderly couple shared a piece of pie by the window. He took a seat in the far corner and let his eyes wander, grateful for the calm. Then he saw her, a slender woman, her back slightly stooped, moving slowly between tables. She was wiping surfaces with small, careful strokes, as if the rag weighed more than it should. Her hands trembled, not from clumsiness, but from age. There was something familiar about the way she moved, gentle, precise, like someone who once handled fragile things with care. When she turned to face the counter, their eyes met. It hit him instantly. That face, aged but unmistakable, Maria. His childhood flashed before him in fragments. The gentle lullabies in Cosa. The way she'd tie a scarf around her head in the mornings. The soft pat on his back when he woke from bad dreams. She had been his caretaker, his safe place, during those early years in South Africa. And now, here she was, wiping crumbs off cafe tables, her hands shaking from exhaustion. She didn't recognize him. Of course she didn't. He'd grown into a man most people only saw on screens, in headlines, but he remembered her. He stood and walked toward her slowly. "Excuse me," he said, voice steady. "Do you have a minute?" She turned to him with a tired smile. "Only if I can clean your table while we talk," she replied with a chuckle. They spoke briefly. He didn't reveal who he was, only asked how long she'd been working here. She explained she worked mornings at the cafe and evenings with a cleaning company downtown. Said rent had gone up again, and Social Security barely covered groceries. Elon listened, nodding, but inside, something tightened. This woman had once kept him safe. Now the world had forgotten her, left her scrubbing floors at 85. A shift manager walked by, tall, young, with a name tag reading, Travis. He tapped his watch, glanced at Maria, and muttered just loud enough, "Let's keep it moving. We've got customers waiting." His tone wasn't loud, but it was sharp, not cruel, just dismissive, as if Maria were an outdated appliance, still functioning but no longer worth much attention. Elon felt the familiar burn rise behind his ribs. He didn't say anything, not yet. He watched. Maria dipped her head slightly, didn't argue. She turned to clean the next table, one hand pressing against her lower back. Elon stayed for a few more minutes, ordered a coffee he didn't touch. When he left, he placed a crisp $100 bill beneath the saucer. She didn't notice. She was still wiping, still moving slowly, still invisible. Outside, he paused under the awning and looked back through the window. She was bending to pick up a fallen napkin. He didn't know what he was going to do next, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't walking away from this. Elon returned to the cafe the next day just after noon, the sun climbing high and sharp over the rooftops. The streets were livelier now, filled with chatter and footsteps. But inside the cafe, the same quiet rhythm pulsed beneath the sound of clinking mugs and low conversation. He slipped into the same corner seat as yesterday, his presence unnoticed. Maria moved slowly through the space, her apron freshly ironed, her expression calm. She didn't see him this time. Or perhaps she did, and simply didn't think twice. A familiar stranger in a world too busy to recognize anyone. Travis, the shift manager, was already pacing behind the counter, barking out reminders and complaints to staff. His words weren't always loud, but they carried a tone, sharp, condescending, the kind that stuck in the back of your throat even after the sound had passed. Maria was near the pastry case, a tray in her hand, when her foot caught the corner of a mat. A small cup of water tilted on the edge of a nearby table and spilled onto the floor. Travis walked over in 3 quick steps. "You can't be serious," he muttered. "That's the second time this week." Maria opened her mouth to speak, but he cut her off. "You know what? Never mind. Maybe it's time someone else handled the floor. Honestly, at your age, you should be home resting, not making more work for everyone else." His words weren't shouted. That's what made them worse. They were spoken like fact, without malice or emotion, just a cold statement dressed as concern. At a nearby table, a young employee, his name tag said Daniel, paused with a tray in his hands. He looked at Maria, then at Travis. His lips tightened, but he said nothing. His eyes dropped back to the floor. Elon noticed. Maria knelt slowly to wipe the spill, her fingers stiff. She didn't defend herself. She didn't ask for fairness. She just cleaned, like she always did. A few minutes later, she approached Travis quietly. "Would it be all right if I take my 15?" she asked. "I need to take my medication." He glanced at the growing line near the register, then back at her. "Now's not a good time. Take it after rush." Her shoulders sank, but she nodded. Elon could see the faint tremble in her left hand, the one she used to press against her hip when the pain got bad. She turned back toward the tables. As she passed, Travis leaned toward another barista and spoke just loud enough. "I'm cutting her hours next month. She's not keeping up." The other worker didn't respond, just gave a quick, uncomfortable smile and turned away. Moments later, a man in a business suit seated near the front called out angrily, waving his hand at a dirty table, "Is someone going to clean this? Or what? I've been sitting here 5 minutes." Before anyone else could respond, Travis pointed straight at Maria. "Maria, you missed a spot again. Can we please stay on top of this?" Heads turned. Maria's face flushed, and she hurried over. Her voice, soft and apologetic, barely rose above the hum of conversation. "I'm sorry, sir. I'll take care of it right now." As she reached for the cloth, her hand knocked over a spoon. It clattered to the ground. The businessman rolled his eyes. Travis threw up his hands. Elon sat still, his coffee untouched. The scene unfolded like a quiet unraveling. Thread by thread, no shouting, no violence, just 100 little indignities stacked one on top of another. He looked at Maria. Her head was bowed, her hands working quickly, her pride tucked away behind years of habit. And then he stood. He didn't say a word. He walked out, pushing the door open with more force than necessary. The bell above it rang, sharp and quick. Outside, he paused for only a second before heading down the sidewalk. He didn't know exactly how it would happen yet, but he knew this much. He wasn't going to leave things the way they were. Later that evening, long after the sun had disappeared behind the buildings and the street lamps cast their glow across the quiet sidewalks, Elon waited across the street from the cafe. He leaned against a lamppost, hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, his breath soft in the cooling air. He saw her exit the cafe through the side door, moving slower than she had that morning. Maria walked with measured steps, careful and steady, her purse strapped diagonally across her chest. Elon followed at a distance, his pace matching hers but never close enough to be noticed. She passed through 3 intersections, turned down a side street with shuttered storefronts, and stopped in front of an aging 2-story brick building with a single flickering neon sign, Night Pro Services. It looked more like a back-office supply hub than a company headquarters. A metal door propped open led into a dim hallway, where tired voices echoed faintly. Elon didn't go in. He stayed just close enough to watch her disappear into the building. He circled around to the alley and found a partially open loading bay door, its rusted tracks groaning in the wind. He stepped into the shadows near the edge and peered inside. It wasn't a place meant for comfort. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a dull sheen over concrete floors and mismatched lockers. He saw Maria among a small group, maybe 8 or 9 others, most of them older. all changing into navy blue uniforms that looked like they hadn't been updated in decades. No one spoke loudly. There was a heaviness in the air, like they were all carrying something more than brooms and buckets. Then, a man stepped into view. Tall, mid-50s, crisp shirt tucked into belted slacks. He carried a clipboard and a permanent frown. The badge on his chest read, Henry Calden, Zone Supervisor. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. Let's get one thing straight, Calden said, his voice flat and practiced. The hotel called again about streaks on the bathroom mirrors. If you can't meet expectations, there are others who can. No one responded. He kept going. This company has a reputation. If your section gets flagged one more time, bonuses are off the table. I don't care if you've been here 5 months or 15 years. Elon watched as Maria kept her eyes on the ground. Her fingers twisted the edge of her shirt. No one dared to raise a hand or ask a question. The man wasn't yelling, but the power was all in the silence he controlled. He turned to leave, then paused. And for anyone thinking about taking extra breaks or asking for lighter shifts, don't. We're already short-staffed. We need reliability, not excuses. Then he walked out. Maria reached for her mop. She said nothing. Elon moved quietly away from the door, heart pounding, anger rising not in a flash, but in a slow, steady boil. He had seen corporate cruelty before, but this was something else. This wasn't about bottom lines or investor reports. This was about a group of forgotten people, squeezed until they broke, and no one looking twice because they were invisible by design. Back in his car, he called his assistant. I need everything you can find on Night Pro Services. Ownership, legal history, complaint records, especially labor practices involving senior employees. I want a report by morning. His voice was low, measured. Within the hour, his assistant texted him a short summary. Night Pro had quietly settled 2 labor-related disputes in the past 5 years. Both involved older workers. Both cases never made it past arbitration. No fines, no press. One former employee had filed a claim for discrimination based on age after being moved to night shifts despite medical concerns. She was terminated within 6 months. The company's defense? Restructuring. Elon looked out his windshield at the red glow of the building's exit sign. The system wasn't broken. It was built like this on purpose. He was still staring when a quiet knock tapped at his passenger window. He turned quickly. A young woman stood there in a Night Pro uniform. She looked no older than 22. A plastic name tag clipped crookedly to her shirt. She gave him a cautious glance, then opened the door slightly. I know who you are, she whispered. I saw you earlier. Watching her. Elon sat still, not denying it. She's been trying to get out of the night shift for months. The woman said her heart gets weird after midnight. They won't let her switch. Told her if she can't handle it, she can quit. Elon nodded once. What's your name? Kayla, she said, but don't tell anyone I talked to you. Please. I won't, he replied. She closed the door and walked off without another word. Elon sat in silence for a long while after she left. The hum of the city buzzed in the background. But inside the car, everything felt still. It wasn't just about Maria anymore. It was about all of them. He stared at the building one last time before pulling away. Headlights cutting through the dark street. He had enough pieces now. It was time to start putting them together. The next morning, the wind carried a chill through the streets of San Francisco, and Elon found himself standing across the road from the cafe once more. But today, he didn't go inside. He stood by a newspaper rack near the curb, hands in his coat pockets, his eyes fixed on the familiar glass door. Inside, Maria moved with visible effort. There was a slight drag in her left foot, and the tremor in her hand was more pronounced than the day before. Her eyes looked tired, puffy around the edges. She worked quietly, wiping down tables and straightening menus with the kind of precision that comes from habit, not strength. Elon's gaze shifted to the counter, where Travis, the shift manager, stood speaking in a low voice to another barista. She's not making it through the month, Travis said, his tone flat, careless. I already submitted the request to replace her. Just waiting on approval. The other barista didn't reply. She just nodded, eyes down, as if pretending not to hear the cruelty layered into those words. Then the door at the back of the cafe opened, and a man Elon hadn't seen before walked in. Mid-50s, tailored jacket, calm expression. He shook a customer's hand near the counter, exchanged a few polite words, then turned his gaze to Maria. That glance told Elon everything. Henry Calden. Same posture, same clipped walk, same steel gaze as the night before at Night Pro. So he wasn't just a supervisor of janitors, he was part owner in the cafe chain too. The kind of man who played puppeteer in two different worlds and didn't blink while pulling the strings. Elon watched as Henry made his way toward Maria. His tone smooth, but his expression sharp. Maria had just finished cleaning a table near the window when her cloth slipped, knocking a ceramic mug to the floor. It shattered loudly, drawing the attention of a few customers. Henry stepped forward, stooping to pick up the largest piece before handing it to her. "I think it's time you consider stepping aside," he said, voice low, eyes steady. "Someone like you shouldn't be a burden on the company." His words weren't loud, but the silence that followed was. The woman at the table next to Maria looked away. A young man near the counter set his coffee down, suddenly uncomfortable. No one said a word. Maria didn't respond right away. Her eyes lowered, her lips trembled slightly, but she didn't argue. She knelt to gather the rest of the pieces. One by one, her hands shaking so badly the shards clinked in her grip. That was when the door opened again. Elon stepped in, the small brass bell overhead announcing his presence. He didn't glance at Henry or Travis. He walked straight toward Maria, who was still crouched by the broken mug. She looked up, startled. "I'm sorry," she whispered, thinking he might be another customer with a complaint. Elon offered a quiet smile. "I came back to ask your name." She blinked. "My name? If it's not too much trouble." She hesitated, then reached for a napkin and a pen from her apron. Her hand shook as she wrote. The letters uneven, slanted, trailing slightly as if her fingers couldn't quite keep up with her mind. When she handed it to him, her eyes didn't meet his. But he looked at the paper like it held the answer to something far bigger than a name. "Thank you, Maria," he said softly. He didn't stay for coffee. He walked back out as quietly as he had come in. By the time he reached the corner of the block, his phone was already against his ear. "I need everything ready by tonight," he told his attorney. "Night Pro and the cafe group. I want them both, quietly. They don't need to know who's behind it." There was a pause. "Are you sure?" his lawyer asked. Elon watched as a delivery truck rumbled past, leaving behind a swirl of dust and the sharp scent of diesel. "I'm sure," he said, "and start drafting an employee transition plan. I want everyone kept, except the people who treat workers like disposable tools." He ended the call and stood for a moment longer, staring at the city like he was seeing it through a different lens. Not as a tech titan, not as a billionaire, but as someone who had just watched a woman's dignity cracked on the floor like a mug no one bothered to pick up. This wasn't charity. This was a correction. Back in his temporary office tucked high above the noise of San Francisco's streets, Elon stood by the window, watching a fog bank crawl across the bay. His reflection in the glass looked older than he remembered. Not tired, exactly, just sharper, more deliberate. Behind him, a small team had gathered. People he trusted with decisions that never made headlines. No assistance from the public office. No faces the media knew. Only the tight-knit group he turned to when things needed to move fast and quietly. "We're going dark on this," he said, turning from the window. "I want full acquisition of Night Pro and Urban Cup. Majority stakes. Fast." No one asked why. They didn't need to. 2 shell companies were assigned to initiate silent buy-ins. Elon didn't want his name connected to any of it. Not yet. Let them think it was just another investor expanding a portfolio. No ripples. Not until he was ready. His legal lead, Olivia, handed over a thick file. "This is everything we could dig up on Night Pro, including sealed court records from 5 years ago. Class action suit, settled privately. No admission of wrongdoing, but the allegations were strong." She paused, forcing elderly staff to work overnight shifts. No rest breaks. 2 hospitalizations, all swept under the rug. Elon flipped through the documents, stopping at a chart. Names, ages, shifts worked. Maria was one of them. So were 21 others. Most were over 60, nearly all immigrants. Women. Many had no pensions, no family listed as emergency contacts. He looked at the faces on the pages, each one paired with a cold block of text: late clock-ins, minor write-ups, denied leave requests. They weren't employees. They were liabilities waiting to be trimmed. And someone had built an entire business on top of that logic. Meanwhile, across town at the cafe, Travis, the shift manager, was tightening his grip. "I'm going to need that resignation letter, Maria," he said, folding his arms. "It's better if it comes from you. Easier on everyone." Maria looked up from the dish rack, her eyes unreadable. "I can still work," she said softly. "I've always finished my shifts." Travis offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "And I've been patient, haven't I? But this isn't about one shift. It's about what's sustainable. You don't want to be the reason we have an accident, do you?" She said nothing, just turned back to rinse another mug. Later, Travis pulled one of the newer baristas aside. "Liam, barely 23, quiet but observant. You've been getting a little too involved," Travis said, voice low. "Careful where you place your loyalties. This job has a probationary period for a reason." Liam swallowed, unsure of what to say. He'd seen how Maria moved slower each day. He'd watched customers ignore her, or worse, pity her. He didn't know her story, but something about how she held herself made him believe she didn't want pity, just respect. But Travis's tone was clear. "Step out of line, and you're next." That night, Elon's office line rang, a private number routed through 3 layers of forwarding. "This is Jackson," the voice said. "I used to work for Night Pro. Took a fall on a night shift. Tore my rotator cuff. They blamed me, said I didn't follow protocol. Fired me before I finished healing. I heard you're trying to do something. Thought maybe you'd want to hear what really goes on behind their closed doors." Elon nodded, though the man couldn't see it. "I do. I kept records, emails, memos, timecard edits. I didn't know who to give them to before. But I'm guessing you've got a reason for digging." "I do," Elon repeated. "Meet my legal team tomorrow. We'll make it safe for you." As the call ended, Olivia walked back in. "Something else," she said, handing over a single-page document. Elon read the header: Urban Cup Holdings, internal transfer of voting rights. "One of the silent partners is looking to cash out," she explained. "They've sent the offer directly to one of our fronts. If we accept, you'll control Urban Cup by the end of the week." Elon stared at the page. The number was high, but not unreasonable. The timing, perfect. He didn't say yes, not yet, but the pen was already in his hand. Outside, the city lights blinked through the fog, each one a quiet pulse in the darkness. Somewhere in that web of light, Maria was finishing another shift, bent over a mop, breathing through the ache in her back, believing she had no one that was going to change. The next morning, Elon dressed down in jeans, a plain gray sweater, and a soft-billed cap. Nothing flashy, just another man with too much time and money, supposedly scouting properties in the area. He walked into the cafe like he didn't already own the building they leased. Travis, the shift manager, didn't recognize him. Of course he didn't. He was too focused on impressing what he thought was a new investor. "Urban Cup's been part of this block for 8 years," Travis said, leading Elon on a casual walk through. "Foot traffic's great, especially around lunchtime. Our clientele's shifting younger, more tech, more your kind of people." Elon nodded, eyes drifting past the polished counters and eco-friendly signage. His gaze landed on Maria, wiping down a high table near the back. She moved slower than before. Her shoulders were hunched, her left hand clutching the rag a bit too tightly, as if willing herself not to drop it. Travis leaned in. "Between you and me," he said, voice dropping like they were sharing a secret, "we're looking to refresh the team. The older staff? They've had their run. Maria's probably done this week. Got approval from upstairs, just waiting on her to sign." He smiled, as if expecting agreement. Elon didn't flinch, just gave a polite nod, like he'd heard this kind of thing before and had long since stopped caring. But inside, something twisted. After finishing his drink, Elon stepped outside and signaled to Liam, the young barista, who was just clocking out. The kid looked surprised but followed him to the edge of the sidewalk. "You seem like someone who notices things," Elon said quietly. Liam hesitated. I guess. How long have you worked here? Just over 4 months. You've seen how Maria's treated? Liam shifted his weight. I try to stay out of stuff. Management doesn't like interference. Elon nodded slowly. Sometimes staying out of it means letting the wrong people win. Liam didn't answer right away. His eyes dropped to the sidewalk. Then he said, almost to himself, she never complains. She just works. Every day. That's why I'm asking, Elon said, his voice low but firm. Because people like her never do. That night, he returned to Night Pro. This time, he didn't try to hide. He stood outside the service entrance as the shift changed, watching quietly as women, some hunched, some limping, filed into the building wearing faded uniforms. He saw Maria last. She adjusted the straps on her work apron, then paused before going in, as if bracing herself. Her breath hung in the cold air, small and invisible against the city's distant hum. Elon didn't follow. He just stood there, still, remembering. He was 5 again, sick with the flu, lying on a thin mattress in a dusty room. And Maria, humming gently, placing a warm cloth on his forehead. She never raised her voice, never asked for thanks, just showed up, every morning, with a kindness that asked for nothing in return. Back at the office the next day, Elon walked in early and asked Olivia to prepare the documents. All of it? She asked. All of it, he said. The ownership transfer for Urban Cup was signed first, clean, fast, hidden behind 2 investment vehicles. Then came Night Pro. That one took longer, but by midday, the paperwork was done. Elon, Olivia said, tapping on her tablet, you'll have controlling interest in both by Thursday morning. He nodded, but before she could leave, his phone buzzed with a secure message. An internal email had just surfaced, sent from Richard Kane, Nightpro's regional director, the man Elon had only seen from afar. The subject line read, Cost Optimization Proposal. The body of the email was blunt. If we begin phasing out staff over 60, we'll cut insurance costs by 18% and overtime by 12%. These transitions should be framed as voluntary retirements. Those who resist can be encouraged with tighter scheduling or performance reviews. It had been deleted minutes after sending, but not before someone flagged it. Elon opened the attachment, his jaw tightening. The list included Maria, top of the page. He didn't forward the email. He saved it, quietly, then looked back at the photo of Maria on her employment record, her ID badge slightly crooked. Eyes tired but gentle. The war hadn't started publicly yet. But the first shot had just been fired. The next morning, nothing changed on the surface. Maria showed up to the cafe at 6:55 a.m., as she always did, holding a thermos of instant coffee and moving with quiet resolve. Her eyes, though tired, carried no trace of defeat. She didn't know that just 48 hours ago, her name had come across a table where decisions that could ruin lives were being made, again. Elon kept his distance. He didn't want to disrupt the fragile balance just yet. Now that the ownership papers were finalized, his control was absolute, but invisible. No press releases, no internal memos, not yet. Let them act freely. Let them reveal themselves. That was the plan. At Night Pro headquarters, a closed-door strategy meeting was underway. Richard Kane stood at the front of a glass-walled conference room. Sleeves rolled up, voice smooth, as if he were discussing logistics. Not lives. Our priority is efficiency, Kane said, gesturing to a projection slide. We're carrying more weight than we need. The numbers don't lie. Staff over 60 generate 38% fewer completed tasks per hour. Cost 22% more in long-term insurance. And, frankly, affect how our brand is perceived. A pause. It's time to be honest. Sentiment doesn't pay the bills. This restructuring is necessary. The screen shifted. Names appeared. At the top was Maria Gonzalez. Below her were 22 others, all over the age of 60. Most of them women, immigrants, quiet, loyal, forgotten. In a corner seat, an assistant disguised as an HR temp, Elon's plant, carefully angled a slim recording device toward the speakerphone. Every word was captured. Meanwhile, Liam, the young barista from Urban Cup, sat in the break room staring at the printed form in his lap. It was titled, Performance Reevaluation Request, and pre-filled with Maria's name. All he had to do was sign at the bottom, acknowledging her as not meeting updated standards of operational efficiency. He didn't sign. Instead, he took the paper, walked to the counter, and tore it in half right in front of Travis. "I'm not doing it," Liam said, voice calm but steady. "You want someone to sign off on that? Get someone else." Travis stared, half amused, half annoyed. "You really think you're saving anyone? People like her, they don't belong in this industry anymore. You'll figure that out the hard way." That afternoon, Kane summoned Liam to his office. The tone was professional, but the threat was clear. "You've got a promising track here," Kane said, leaning back in his chair. "Don't let personal feelings derail that." "She's worked longer than I've been alive," Liam replied, "and she still works harder than most people here." Kane smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "People like Maria disappear eventually. They don't need help disappearing. Your job isn't to stop the tide. It's to stay afloat." He let the silence stretch. "Unless you'd rather join her." Liam said nothing. He only nodded, stood up, and walked out of the office. But not before clicking the side of his phone to stop the recording. That night, Liam met quietly with one of Elon's assistants. He handed over the audio file and a short note. "Tell him she's not alone." The next morning, Elon sat at his temporary desk, eyes scanning over numbers from Nitpro's payroll system. Olivia stood nearby, flipping through spreadsheets. "There's a discrepancy," she said, tapping the screen. "Over the past year, bonuses have been issued to less than half the senior staff. At first glance, it looks like performance-based distribution. But these employees," she pointed to several names including Maria's, "had their logged hours altered before bonus calculations were processed." "Altered how?" Elon asked. "Trimmed just under eligibility minimums. Enough to disqualify them from quarterly bonuses. In some cases, entire shifts were removed." He leaned back, jaw tightening. "So they worked, but the system said they didn't." Olivia nodded. "Precisely." Elon sat in silence, fingers steepled. They weren't just being discarded. They were being erased. And someone had built a system to do it quietly. It was a quiet Thursday morning when Elon sat behind a simple desk at his temporary office, overlooking a street that buzzed with delivery vans, early commuters, and worn-out cafe workers. He didn't need a corner suite or polished floors to feel in control. What mattered now was timing. He had watched long enough. The silent cruelty, the polite indifference, the quiet systems of erasure, they weren't abstract anymore. They had names, faces, trembling hands and weary smiles. And now, it was time to bring it all to light. By mid-afternoon, his legal team had reviewed every contract clause. HR violations, unpaid overtime, illegal shift extensions, even a pension adjustment formula that somehow always worked against the older staff. It was all documented, highlighted, and ready. But Elon didn't want a courtroom spectacle. He wanted them to hear the truth, seated in the very rooms where they once believed they held power. The invitation was sent for an urgent executive meeting, under the pretense of finalizing budget reallocation plans. No one suspected anything beyond routine administration. Inside the main conference room, the table was polished, the water bottles lined in neat rows, and folders were stacked beside each chair. Richard Kane sat at the head of the table, leaning slightly forward, as if already ready to sign. He glanced at the clock. "Let's begin," he said, nodding at Travis to read the performance report. Travis cleared his throat. "We've reviewed Maria Gonzalez's recent work records. There are clear signs of decline, missed table wipes, customer complaints, even a broken mug last week. Our recommendation is a dignified retirement package with no further obligations." He read each word without flinching, never once glancing at the older employees' names in the margin. Kane reached for the pen. That's when the door opened. Elon stepped in, not rushed, not theatrical, calm. His presence didn't raise voices, but it dropped them. Travis blinked, confused. Kane's hand froze midair. "Mr. Musk," Kane said, standing slowly, a polite smile creeping up like a reflex. "What an honor. We were just handling some lingering operational details." "I know," Elon replied, setting a thin folder on the table. Flipping it open. "I believe this is yours." Inside were three things. A printed email, sent from Kane's account 6 weeks ago. outlining a strategy to reduce senior staff without triggering legal red flags. A transcript of his conversation with Liam, peppered with subtle threats and dismissive language, and a ledger comparison, showing the deliberate exclusion of bonus hours for elderly staff. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't point fingers. He just let the silence work. "You forgot something," Elon said, looking at no one in particular. "You forgot these are people, not costs." The silence grew heavier. Elon closed the folder. "Effective immediately. There will be no termination of Maria Gonzalez's position," he said. "In fact, she will serve as an honorary advisor to a new community development initiative we're building, focused on preserving the dignity of experienced workers." Gasps rippled around the room. "And I'd also like to announce the creation of the Maria Fund," he continued, "a yearly grant that will provide financial support to elderly laborers who've fallen through the cracks of the system." No one interrupted. Kane sat down slowly, his face pale. Elon offered no lectures, no revenge, just action. He walked out without another word. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the streetlights blinked on one by one, Elon stepped out of the building through the side entrance. The air was crisp, still. He didn't expect anyone to follow. But there she was. Maria stood just beyond the awning, her shoulders slightly hunched from years of work, but her eyes bright. She reached out, taking his hand in both of hers. They were smaller than he remembered, but just as steady now. "I always knew you'd grow up to be someone who cares about the little things," she whispered. Elon smiled. Not the one he used in interviews, but the quiet kind, the one you wear when a piece of your past returns. Not to haunt you, but to remind you who you are. The atmosphere inside the upper floors of Urban Cup's headquarters had shifted. Whispers buzzed through the cubicles and behind office doors. The once faceless investor who had swiftly taken over 2 companies was now known, at least internally. Elon Musk's name floated from mouth to mouth, but no one dared say it aloud in a meeting yet. The official announcement hadn't come, but the ripple had already started. Richard Kane, sitting alone in his office, stared at his phone. His contacts blinked back, old colleagues, former shareholders, legal consultants from years past. He had spent decades controlling people by predicting them. But now, he felt cornered. He leaned forward and muttered, "He's rewriting the rules." In a last effort to regain influence, Kane made a few quiet calls. He spun a narrative. The company's new direction was based on emotion, not metrics. He said Musk was sentimental, obsessed with an old nanny, and was destabilizing the company's operational integrity. Some listened, others didn't. That same week, Kane drafted a report, on the surface, a routine HR document. It claimed safety violations, procedural delays, and general inefficiency tied to Maria Gonzalez's presence. The document was signed by staff members whose names had long since moved on to other departments, or were never real in the first place. But what he didn't know was that a young accountant in the financial compliance team, Jenny Fields, had been tracking document access logs. She wasn't someone who liked confrontation, but something about the file felt wrong. When she traced its metadata back to Kane's computer, she copied everything and forwarded it straight to the legal team tied to Elon's new task force. The next morning, Elon walked slowly through the halls of the building he now owned, stopping occasionally to greet surprised staff. His calm demeanor didn't match the turbulence Kane was trying to brew. "Schedule a press conference," Elon told his communications lead. "Tomorrow." A room was prepared. It wasn't flashy, just clean, functional, open. Chairs were arranged neatly in rows. A simple black table sat at the front, with 2 chairs on either side. One was for Elon, the other, reserved quietly for Maria Gonzalez. By noon the next day, the room was filled. Journalists from local papers, independent labor organizations, and a few national outlets took their seats. Management sat in a reserved row to the right, Kane in the middle, his posture tight. The event started without a grand opening. Elon leaned forward and spoke in a voice that didn't seek applause. "We often talk about innovation, disruption, and the future," he said, "but we rarely talk about the people who got us here." He gestured toward Maria, who sat quietly beside him, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She wore a simple cardigan, The same kind she used to wear when tucking him in as a child. "This is Maria," Elon continued. "She helped raise me, and she's helped clean after thousands of others since. No one wrote her name down. No one gave her a bonus. But she kept showing up." A reporter raised a hand. Elon nodded. "Mr. Musk, some argue this level of restructuring, driven by one case, is excessive. What would you say to those who claim you're allowing personal sentiment to interfere with corporate responsibility?" The room quieted. Elon didn't answer right away. He picked up a small remote and pressed a button. The screen behind him came to life. A video played, grainy security footage from a staff meeting room. It showed Maria standing with her back slightly hunched, her hands clasped nervously. In the frame were Travis, arms crossed, and Kane, seated and barely glancing up. Their voices, caught clearly, layered cold professionalism over subtle cruelty. "We think it's time you consider stepping down," Travis said. "You've had a good run." Kane added, his voice measured, "But let's be honest, you're a liability now." Maria said nothing in the video. She just nodded, picked up her bag, and left. The room watching it now fell into complete silence. No one looked at Kane. Elon turned back to the audience. "We didn't restructure because of one employee," he said. "We restructured because this was not an isolated incident. It was a system designed to forget people once they stopped being convenient." He stood up slowly. "If we can't build companies that remember the human beings who carried them forward, then maybe we don't deserve to build at all." He stepped back and let the silence settle, deeper now than when he walked in. Kane didn't say a word. Maria didn't need to. She sat quietly, looking out at the crowd, not with shame or pride, just a deep, earned steadiness, a kind of peace that doesn't come from being saved, but from finally being seen. The video didn't just play in that room, it exploded across the country. Within hours, it had been reposted on every major platform. Twitter, Facebook, even Instagram Reels were flooded with clips from the press conference. The sight of an elderly woman being pushed out of a job she had quietly done for decades hit a nerve. Hashtags began trending. Hashtag justice for Maria. Hashtag respect the caregivers. Hashtag dignity at work. Comment sections filled with stories from sons, daughters, and grandchildren of caretakers and cleaners. People remembered the faces in their own lives, women like Maria who had folded their laundry, walked them to school, stayed late without complaint. By the next morning, Richard Kane's name had become synonymous with corporate coldness. His photo, taken as he sat frozen in the conference room, became the face of public anger. News anchors didn't mince words. Investigative reporters began digging into Nightpro's record. A pattern emerged. Undocumented bonuses, falsified reports, intentional scheduling to avoid healthcare liability. The image of corporate efficiency was cracking under the weight of its own hidden cruelties. Maria, meanwhile, had barely slept. Her phone buzzed nonstop. People she hadn't heard from in years called to say they saw her on the news. A woman from her church brought flowers. A local teacher sent a thank you note, signed by her entire class. When she was invited to speak again, this time on her own terms, she was hesitant. But she stood beside Elon, hands clasped in front of her, her voice quiet but sure. "I never thought I'd be seen," she said. "I always believed work was about doing your part and staying out of the way. But maybe it's okay to ask for dignity too." Elon didn't interrupt her. When she finished, he stepped forward and spoke without notes. "This isn't charity, and it's not a favor. It's an apology, long overdue, from a system that profited from silence and forgot to say thank you." The room stood still. Then came the applause, not the polite kind, but the deep, sustained kind that breaks through tension like light through old glass. In the following weeks, changes happened fast. Kane was removed from his position and placed under formal investigation by labor auditors. The list of manipulated accounts and coerced resignations kept growing. Urban Cup and Night Pro both underwent full external audits. Travis, the cafe manager who once barked at Maria to move faster, submitted his resignation quietly. He left no note. No one asked him to stay. Several mid-level managers were reassigned and required to attend an intensive human ethics in management program. A new training series developed under Elon's direction. But the most lasting change didn't happen in the boardroom. Elon launched the Maria Community Initiative, a program designed not just to compensate, but to restore. Former caretakers, housekeepers, and retired nurses, many of whom had slipped through the cracks of retirement systems, were invited to apply for medical support. Part-time flexible work, and housing assistance. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. And the little coffee shop on 8th Street, the one where it all began, got a new name. In quiet ceremony, the old metal sign came down. A new one was lifted in its place, Maria House. Underneath it, in soft gold script, read the new slogan, "Where silent heroes are seen." That afternoon, Maria stood beneath the sign, staring up with eyes that looked heavier than yesterday, but somehow gentler too. A breeze passed by. From behind her, a voice spoke up, low, shaky, but certain. "I was just like you. Fired at 64. They told me I was too slow. Too old. Today I feel like I can breathe again." Maria turned. It was another woman, gray hair pinned back, hands still rough from years of work. They didn't hug. They didn't cry. They just looked at each other. And in that look was an understanding so deep, no policy could ever capture it. Maria nodded slowly. "You're not alone anymore," she whispered. Behind them, the world kept moving. People ordering coffee, typing emails, running late to meetings, but now, just for a moment, someone had stopped to look. And that meant everything. The noise hadn't quieted down, it had grown. After the press conference, the public pressure on companies like Night Pro and Urban Cup didn't slow. If anything, it gained momentum. Activists, teachers, and local community leaders reached out in droves. Elon, however, declined all speaking invitations. Instead, he asked for something simple. Let Maria speak. So, when the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the first Maria House was scheduled, she stood at the podium, not in a suit or polished heels, but in her simple work shoes and a soft blue sweater she'd worn for years. The stage wasn't grand, just a modest space set up in a renovated community hall with folding chairs and warm light. She didn't have notes. "I spent most of my life cleaning up after people," she began, voice slow but clear, "wiping crumbs, folding blankets, scrubbing floors, jobs no one really looks at twice. And I didn't mind, but the hardest part wasn't the work. It was being invisible." A pause settled over the room. "There are still thousands like me out there. Women, mostly, quiet, tired, steady. They don't need a handout. They need someone to say, 'I see you.'" People stood. Applause didn't break the silence, it honored it. Back inside the office, the fallout for Richard Kane was swift. After weeks of internal review, Night Pro's board publicly acknowledged the wrongdoing. A carefully worded memo was sent company-wide, the termination of Kane's contract, along with a formal apology to every employee affected by prior discriminatory practices. It didn't fix the past, but it acknowledged it. Still, Elon refused to press charges. When asked why, he answered plainly, "This isn't about one man behind bars. It's about an industry waking up to how it treats those who made it possible in the first place." Some shareholders weren't pleased. They called the initiatives sentimental, costly, impractical. But as national media continued praising the cultural shift and stock performance began ticking upward, their resistance faded. Numbers had a way of changing minds when principles didn't. Across Urban Cup locations and Night Pro offices, something else began to change. Not through corporate mandates, but grassroots efforts. Store managers hosted lunch breaks where younger staff could sit with older employees and simply listen. Cleaning teams started using first names instead of job titles. Even customers noticed. A subtle warmth was returning to places that had once felt cold. Then came the television appearance. Elon was invited for a national interview. The host expected a polished PR campaign. Instead, Elon sat back, crossed his legs, and leaned into the microphone. "I didn't do something heroic," he said. "I just remembered who used to help me tie my shoes, who stood by my crib when my parents were busy, who made sure I felt safe before I even knew what safety was." He paused, his voice steady but low. "Her name was Maria, and I owed her something real. Not just a thank you, but a world that sees her." The next day, Maria received a phone call. It wasn't a news outlet or a foundation asking for an interview. It was a woman named Janet, calling from an education nonprofit based in Vermont. She had seen the broadcast and was developing a new national curriculum on ethics and dignity in the workplace. "We'd like to include your story," Janet said, "not just for social studies or economics. We want young people to understand respect, not just for CEOs and pioneers, but for the ones who hold everything together without ever being noticed." Maria was quiet for a long moment. "You really think they'd want to hear about someone like me?" Janet replied without hesitation. "I think they need to." Later that evening, Maria sat on a bench outside the newly finished community space that now bore her name. She watched two teenagers paint a mural on the outer wall, a scene of an older woman holding a mop, surrounded by soft rays of gold. And at the bottom, in block letters, they wrote, "No one is invisible." 1 year had passed, but the quiet ripple that began with a single moment inside a small cafe had become something much more. Maria House now had branches in 6 cities: Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, Denver, Atlanta, and Seattle. They weren't grand buildings or government-backed institutions. They were warm, simple spaces that offered shelter, light jobs, and most importantly, dignity to over 300 people. Former nannies, housekeepers, night shift workers. Those who had once lived in the background were now finding comfort. And in some cases, a sense of family. Maria no longer clocked in at dawn or scrubbed tables during lunch rushes. But she was still a presence. Most afternoons, she could be found in a wooden chair out front of the original center, shaded by a cottonwood tree, her posture upright but relaxed. She didn't lead with speeches or advice. She listened. People came to talk, sometimes about aching joints, or rent prices, or grandkids who never called. Other times, they talked about things they'd buried long ago, jobs they were let go from without notice, employers who never remembered their names, memories they'd been told didn't matter. That afternoon, Maria sat with a letter in her lap. The envelope was pink and hand-addressed. She had opened it slowly, carefully flattening the page to read the words. "I read about you in school. My mom is a housekeeper too. Your story made me believe my mom deserves respect." It was signed, just one name, followed by an age, 15. Maria held the paper gently, her thumb brushing the edge as though afraid it might vanish. Her lips curved into a soft smile. She folded it back into the envelope, held it to her chest, and stared ahead, lost in thought. Across the street, Elon stood quietly. He didn't wave, didn't call her name. He just stood with his hands in his pockets, watching the small group gathered near her, laughing, sipping coffee, someone handing her a knitted scarf. After a minute, he turned and walked away. He wasn't there to be seen. Back at the renovated cafe, now named Maria House Cafe, the staff had planned something modest but meaningful. No ribbon cutting, no press, just a framed portrait hung near the counter. In it, Maria stood near a window, sunlight on her shoulder, a cloth in her hand. Mid-motion, below it was a brass plaque that read, "The Keeper of Kindness." When the manager pulled the cloth from the portrait, the cafe went silent for a moment, not out of formality, but respect. Then someone started clapping, slow, sure, and soon joined by the others. Maria chuckled under her breath and shook her head. "I thought I'd leave this world quietly," she said, "but it turns out, even the smallest things have a voice. If someone's willing to listen." She didn't say much more, just placed a hand on the frame, then turned to join the others for tea and conversation. That night, after the laughter faded and the center quieted, Maria walked slowly back to her room. The hallway was dim but peaceful, with soft humming from the old radio in the common room drifting faintly behind her. At her door, she paused. There was something on the floor. A box, small, square, with a familiar feel. No return address, just her name, written in bold letters across the top. She picked it up, stepped inside, and turned on the lamp by her bed. Inside was a worn notebook. The corners were bent, the pages yellowed at the edges. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Scrawled in the messy handwriting of a child were 4 words across the first page. "Maria, my favorite person." She stared for a long moment, then flipped to the next page. There, in neater writing, clearly added recently, was a new message. "Thank you for never giving up on me. Now it's my turn." Maria's eyes welled with tears. But her face remained calm. She closed the notebook, placed it gently beside her pillow, and sat on the edge of her bed. Outside, the wind rustled the trees. Inside, a woman who once thought she'd leave unnoticed now rested quietly, knowing that what she gave to the world, patience, care, and quiet strength, had finally found its way back. Sometimes, it takes just one quiet act of recognition to rewrite the story of a lifetime. Elon's gesture wasn't about charity, it was about remembering. About honoring the invisible hands that shaped us when no one else was watching. How many silent heroes are still out there, unnoticed, unheard? What would happen if we all chose to look back, just once? If this story moved you, leave a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe to Shadow Secrets for more powerful, true-to-life stories that reveal the human side of the unexpected. We've only just begun.